Hello, and welcome to the first iIIRG in Conversation webinar of 2026, a production of the International Investigative Interviewing Research Group. My name is Christopher Kelly, and along with Susanna Flolo, we are the co-directors of iIIRG and are very happy that you are here with us for a special edition of this webinar. Today, we'll be focusing on investigative interviewing in Ukraine. And before I turn it over to our panel of experts, please allow me to make a few announcements. If this is your first iIIRG event, welcome and thank you for being here. iIIRG is the world's largest network of practitioners, researchers, and professionals driving effective and ethical information gathering from individuals who may possess critical information. We unite to advance evidence-based practices that inform and enhance justice and security while maintaining the highest ethical standards in investigative interviewing. In addition to these quarterly webinars, we hold biennial in-person conferences, the next of which is happening the week of 6 July in Leuven, Belgium. As is our tradition, the first 2 days of the week will be a masterclass, and this year's theme is on interviewing child suspects, which is co-sponsored by the Implemendes Cost Action Group, and we thank Professors Dave Walsh and Yvonne Daly for their support. Then, on the Wednesday of that week through Friday is a traditional conference, including plenty of opportunities for socializing with old friends and making new ones. Notably, there is still time to submit your abstracts for individual oral presentations, thematic panels, practitioner case studies, and posters, as the deadline to do so is next Friday, the 27th of February. Please visit conference.irg.org to submit your abstracts and for information related to accommodations and transportation. Leuven is a wonderfully charming city, just a 13-minute train ride from the main Brussels airport, and we are really excited to see you there in person in less than 5 months. If you're not a member of iIIRG, we hope that you consider joining us to support events such as this webinar, plus gaining access to the largest worldwide network of investigative interviewing professionals, and to receive discounts on future conferences and access to materials such as webinar recordings and networking grants. Finally, for today, if you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the Q&A box, as Susanna and I will be asking them of our panelists in the last 10 or 15 minutes of the session. Speaking of herself, I am pleased to turn it over to iIIRG co-director Susanna Flolo, who will be moderating today's discussion. Take it away, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Chris. And hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world. Before we begin, I want to start by acknowledging the profound challenges that Ukraine is facing today. The work of strengthening rights-based investigative interviewing is taking place not only in the midst of ambitious national reform, but first and foremost against the backdrop of a full-scale invasion by the Russian Federation that continues to bring immense suffering upon the Ukrainian people. And I want to praise the courage of those who persist in advancing justice, accountability, and humane practices under such horrific circumstances. And I'm honored to host this panel alongside some of those people today. So for this webinar, we will be focusing on a topic of both national and global importance, which is the development and implementation of investigative interviewing in Ukraine during this period of war and reform. So this discussion brings together three remarkable experts whose work spans policy, operational practice, training, and system transformation. Now let me introduce them. So first off, we have Yuriy Belousov, who is the Deputy Director of the Bureau of Economic Security of Ukraine, responsible for human capital development. And he brings more than 20 years of experience in law enforcement and human rights protection. Yuriy previously served as Deputy Ombudsman of Ukraine for the prevention of torture and later headed the Prosecutor General's Office departments investigating human rights violations by law enforcement and for 4 years war crimes. Over the past decade, he has played a central role in integrating investigative interviewing standards into prosecutorial practice, including in complex war crime investigations. Second, we have Vasylyna Yavorska, who is the CEO of JustGroup, a national non-state organization advancing a fair, efficient, and human-centered criminal justice system in Ukraine. She leads evidence-based reform initiatives, including the country's first university course on investigative interviewing. Since 2017, Vasylyna has coordinated a national community of experts and instructors dedicated to developing investigative interviewing in Ukraine, working on the design and implementation of training programs for criminal justice practitioners across the country. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Gary Pankhurst, who is my predecessor as director of iIIRG, but we're not letting go of him just yet. Gary is also a forensic psychology lecturer at Newcastle University, specializing in investigative interviewing and the improvement of criminal justice responses to sexual offenses and violence against women and girls. His research focuses on investigative interviews with sexual offense suspects through a procedural lens, examining how interviewer behavior, communication, and perceptions of fairness shape information disclosure. Gary has extensive experience supporting practitioner training and evidence-based practice, and was involved in some of the earliest investigative interviewing training initiatives in Ukraine back in 2019, contributing to the foundations of the national reform effort. Thank you all for being here, and now let's get started. And to begin with, I would like to ask all of you to share how you became involved with investigative interviewing and why investigative interviewing matters in your current work. And if you don't mind, I would like to start with you, Yuri, followed by Vasylyna, and then Gary. Please.
Susanna, dear colleagues, dear participants, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. It's a unique opportunity for us to talk about our experience and to get information about the experience of other countries. It's really fruitful and useful for us. As to my first experience, I was injected, as I call it, with investigative interviewing first in 2016 when I was occasionally appeared on the meeting with Juan Mendes and other guys who were discussing the idea to design a special principles. At that moment, I was a deputy ombudsman. I was responsible for prevention of torture and ill treatment. And the idea, how it was presented, really amazed me because for years before, we were talking, as I call it, like a prohibition language with law enforcement. You shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do this. And law enforcement were always asking, okay, what should we do? And that was a gap. We said, okay, we are human rights activists. It's not our business. You should find a way what to do your things properly. But here, the idea that there is an instrument which could give law enforcement an opportunity to do their job from the one side and not to violate human rights on another side. And this combination really amazed me. And since that time, I'm trying to be involved in different activities related to investigative interviewing.
Thank you so much. And Vasylyna?
Hello, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and have this opportunity to share some of our thoughts or some of our lessons. I would start probably from very similar experience as Yuri already mentioned. I have many years of human rights work. Worked with human rights organization, and we did a lot of monitoring of law enforcement here in Ukraine, and it always was the challenge. We always have the long list of recommendations, but usually it was like, don't do that, and don't do this point. And I believe that when actually Yuri was at that meeting in New York, he was that person who came to the community of people from human rights background and talked that, guys, we need to do more. We talk with practitioners with some instrument, with language of capacity building, and so on. Another point I would like to mention, then I really believe that if we talk about transformation or reform, we need to talk not only about skills or legislation, but also maybe starting with mindset. I worked with human rights and criminal justice project here in Ukraine more than 15 years, and usually we talk here usually we worked on reform here with legislative tools. So, for example, we have new standards, we have new law, and so on. And what I found when I talk about investigative interviewing, that first of all, we talk about shift in mindset, what we are looking for. And I believe that it's crucial for any change, for any reform, for any transformation. And it was like the point I got it 7 years ago that we need to, when we talk about reform of law enforcement, we need to talk about this shift in mindset, and we need to orient them into this information gathering. And we try to get rid of this confession-based approaches we still had in Ukrainian practice.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, again, Gary, how did you become involved with investigative interviewing?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. So I can't tell you how honoured I feel to be on the same panel as Yuriy and Vasylyna, and you'll see what they've managed to achieve over that time in the coming hour. So there's that. So in terms of my background, well, I have the benefit of being very long in the tooth now. So I guess one of the benefits for me is I started my policing career at a time when the Police and Criminal Evidence Act was just starting. I joined in 1985, which was when the Police and Criminal Evidence Act first came into law. So the benefit for me was the fact that I saw the transformation from a confession-based interviewing system, which was the mindset and the way everybody thought at that time, without thinking that there was any other way, through the process of change. And so as a young and fairly malleable officer, I was one of the early recipients of that training that went out nationally. So I've kind of been through a process where I've seen that transition and how long it can take. So that's something that's been with me really throughout my whole working life. I had an interest in interviewing always. When I went into to becoming a detective, I moved through various phases from being trained to interview children into more complex investigations until I was dealing with major crime, then went on to become an interview advisor. So I've kind of seen it from many different directions, and having left the police after 30 years, I started to study it and realized how little I actually knew. So it's been a really interesting process to look at it from every different direction, to try and work towards how we can look to achieve the best product, but without the always attendant issue of infringing human rights, because it is always going to be an issue where power and control and authority comes up against the freedoms of the individual. And that's it's an interesting place to be, but certainly not if you're on the wrong end of it. So, you know, as we'll, I'm sure, discuss, that's where my heart and my interests really lie this time.
Thank you so much. And of course, I mean, this is implementing or shifting the police investigative practices. Of course, it's a major project, but of course, for Ukraine, you have faced other extraordinary challenges as well in recent years. And I would like to ask you how the full-scale invasion has shaped the urgency or direction of investigative interviewing work in your fields. Starting with you again, Yuriy, if you don't mind.
Thanks, Susanna. Since May 2022 until actually September of last year, I was a head of War Crime Department and Office of the Prosecutor General. And from my perception, investigative interviewing, and great thanks to Vasylyna and the whole Norwegian team who actually helped us in this period, and the British team as well, and all other participants, really, and guys, our friends who helped us, because understanding that investigative interviewing works maybe came significantly to me during this period. Why? Because for me, investigative interviewing is directly connected with the quality of evidence. And when we interview witnesses or suspects, and during the wartime, sometimes you just don't have a second chance, and that's which you have during a peaceful time, potentially. But we have millions of witnesses and victims who left Ukraine, and you understand that maybe you would never see this person again, or witness could die, or the suspect sometimes also could be killed, and you don't have an opportunity to conduct second interview. That means that the quality of interview should be of very high, and it should be done at once. And that's, for me, was maybe some shift in my mindset when I understand why we should. And it was easier for me, good argument how to persuade detectives and prosecutors working in this field why they should do it. Because especially second argument, when there is a huge pressure, when, for example, war crimes prosecutor, they have 2,000 cases per person, so which is difficult even to think about. And you had a huge pressure, and sure, you very, how to say, your time matters, let's say. And sure, if you waste several hours conducting an interview which has no quality or have no sense, let's say, why you should do it. That's why we try to explain that, okay, don't think about, any other, reasons why you should do it. Think just about your case. And if it's a good evidence, you will not have another chance. Prepare and do it in a proper way. That's why, again, for Ukraine, I think it was a good shift since bad conditions, but sometimes, very dangerous and bad conditions, they provoke changes much faster than peaceful times. And second issue, which was also significantly helped us, is the changes to the legislation. Because before open invasion, it was a total ban for the use of pretrial statements in the court. Whatever you do, you could have a best video, you could a lawyer be present, but no chance to use it in the court because the judge was prohibited to use a pretrial statement in the court. Since open invasion, because of all this collapse and there was some changes to the legislation that if you conduct an interview of a witness, and if you did it with a video, so the judge could take it as an evidence, could take it. Sure, the judge decides. But if you talk about the suspect, there has to be present, a lawyer should be present. And if there's a video record of the interview, it could be used again by the judge. Because in any way, these pretty often detectives and prosecutors, they're thinking about the final beneficiary, which pretty often is the judge, whether the judge would take it or not. If not, why should I, do it? And this ban in legislation for good interviewers, for good detectives, we were significantly demotivated. Why should I prepare? Why should I spend significant part of my life if no one would see it except of me? That's why these two changes, this pressure, these changes when you can't have a chance to conduct a second interview, and legislation changes altogether, so gave a good opportunity for us to proceed. And sure, in parallel, we had a good national team of experts in cooperation with the JustGroup organization, with Vasylyna and our Norwegian and British guys, all together, so made a good opportunity for us to make some progress, let's say, in this sphere.
And thank you for that excellent bridge over to Vasylyna. Vasylyna, could you share a bit from the non-governmental perspective on the same matter?
I absolutely agree that a big challenge usually creates a space for opportunity for change, for critical change. And I strongly believe that at that moment in April and May 2022, it was a great challenge for Ukraine and for sure for our criminal justice system. But I remember that discussion at that moment with criminal justice practitioners about cultural choice, that, guys, we need to find out how to confirm that, we are moving in this European direction. We shouldn't treat prisoners of war, Russian prisoners of war, in that way, they treat our people. So we need to do something more, just probably to show this difference. I can say this, yes, that we treat them in another type of way. And I believe, maybe you believe, you remember this as well. The first guidelines we discussed in May 2022, it was guidelines of interviewing prisoners of war. It was really, for me, it was something, very strategic, because it like showed what the where criminal justice system sees a strategic way of development. We are not talking about something minor, but we are talking about how we need the standard in this very challenging context. And I believe it was really a strategic choice, not just like a very operational decision, but it really gave a very good push to practitioners, to policymakers, that we are thinking in this way. And for sure, other circumstances which were mentioned by Yuriy, it was like supporting environment for, somehow developing this approach in that complex context.
You have your hand up, Yuriy. Did you want to add something?
Just a brief comment with Vasylyna, because she reminded the action. But can you imagine? It was the third day of open invasion when the Kyiv was under attack. And do you know what Ukrainian officials were discussing? We are discussing where to keep Russian prisoners of war. And it was really because it was a working group, because we didn't have any legislation. It was the Minister of Defense, these guys who were fighting, they were thinking where to keep Russian prisoners of war. But Russians even didn't believe that we have the prisoners of war, because Russians never could lose. But sorry, it's a bit different topic. But really, during that period, we were thinking about conditions, how to treat them properly, and how to interview them properly. And that's why this first guideline was designed exactly in these days. Yeah.
Thank you. And Gary, you, of course, were also part of some of the early work supporting Ukraine's shift towards investigative interviewing. From your international perspective, what changes have you noticed in the needs or challenges facing Ukrainian practitioners since then?
Thank you, Suzanne. Well, I mean, I can't speak to how it must feel there on a day-to-day basis and with the pressures, because clearly those pressures are not what would be ordinarily experienced by any of the organizations during normal peacetime. But I think what is clear, because the only thing I could equate it to from is going through the process of, for example, the attacks in London, the terrorist attacks in London, and what that felt like in terms of scale and size, and what happens to people's perspective, because that's the thing that can shift very quickly. It takes a long time to build momentum to ensure that rights and the mindset is right, and it needs a framework to sit in, and it takes a long time to build it. It takes a very short time for that to decay without the right people there to ensure that that is retained. And the fact is that doesn't happen by accident. So I think it's interesting that Yuriy and Vasylyna spoke about that need to, what happens with legislation at the point when you are at most difficulty, if you like. You know what you're facing, you know the resource problems, you know how much call there's going to be on so many of the organizations, and yet to still retain the thought that actually there are certain things that are not negotiable. There are certain things that we cannot slide on because ultimately the cost is too high is something that is very difficult to just quantify, but it's possibly the most important thing. And I, if I go back to from what I spoke about originally, which was how I'd seen the process of change from a really quite, I would say, a system that really didn't put human rights in the foreground and was very much confession based, and it was about resolution of cases as quickly as possible, and that had become a shorthand. It would become very easy in terms of, well, it works, we get things through the courts, everybody's happy. But that wasn't a good system, and it wasn't good for justice. And actually, as we now know, it didn't work. So, but what it needed was a strong legislative framework to work. So without the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, I'm not convinced that we would have had peace. We wouldn't have had an investigative interviewing, information gathering based interviewing model that could have gone on to become what it has been, because you have to have a basic level of standards, and that has to be enshrined in law. So without everybody being on the same page, you will inevitably slide backwards, it feels. So I think for Ukraine to have been able to retain and keep moving forward with the pressure that they're in at the moment, I think is an incredible testament to their strength and resolve, but also an understanding that it is a better system. You will actually get those better results by maintaining those standards. And I think that's the thing that needs to shine through, really.
Thank you, Gary. And that brings me over to you again, Yuriy. You've overseen investigations of war crimes and human rights violations. And I wanted to ask you how investigative interviewing has changed the way that sensitive or high stakes cases in particular are handled in Ukraine, sorry.
I think that anyway, Ukraine still in the beginning of its way. Taking into account the scale of the country and the number of people living and number of law enforcement officers, we are definitely in the beginning. That's why I can't say that there's significant shift in all law enforcement already happened. But at the same time, we could rather say that a lot of done to have it happen. Yeah, for example, if we can remember when the Gary, and we had really thanks Gary for that, it was the guy who, there was a darn great, they conducted the first trainings on investigative interviewing in Ukraine for our team, and so a lot of guys in that first training are still living with these ideas, and thanks to Gary, it was significant impact of him as a good trainer and professional. But if we see what was done for this time, so when we have training courses already in investigative interviewing, when we have legislation which already prescribed that, when special courses for children, for interview of children is being designed, and sensitive, vulnerable groups. That's why, I could say that the effect, long-term effect, we would see later. What is good as to this shift, that the investigative interviewing as a term, because 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we were using, no one really understood, okay, what was it? Maybe some fancy thing. Now, when with Vasylyna, we made a presentation in the presence of Prosecutor General, who was sitting in a panel saying that investigative interviewing is something which Office of the Prosecutor General is leading, and he said it towards all heads of law enforcement institutions. So now everyone knows, now everyone understands that, okay, we want also to be trained. So there is already kind of competition between law enforcement. Why they have it, why we don't have it, why this training, the university has a special training course, we don't have it. That's why this dynamics show that situation is developing in the best way. But, I can't, with all my respect to my country and to law enforcement, I can't say that, there's a strong approach already to work with sensitive cases, but there are good examples already. There are already good examples how sensitive cases has to be treated, how sensitive, vulnerable witnesses and victims have to be interviewed, which is a good. But I think, it is to the next kind of step, and we are thinking also about the like scientific support of this movement, because what is well developed in foreign countries, and we did the first research with Vasylyna on investigative interview, but we understand that this methodological and scientific support is something which is really not lacking, but would be good to make such kind of assessment of impact and also the needs where to go and which areas to address. Susanna, for your question.
Yeah, so Vasylyna, you've of course spent nearly a decade building Ukraine's investigative interviewing ecosystems, from expert network to university education. And what do you see as the most important steps towards securing long-term sustainability for these efforts that Yuriy was also speaking about?
I think I would say that probably first of all, when we talk about starting, you really need to have enthusiastic people, because I always need, like to emphasize that everything is about us. So it's our choice, and that we are lucky enough that we had the first event in Kyiv in 2017 with Asbjørn Vasylyv from Norway. And from that time, we have 10 people who constantly researching, developing, talking, pushing, advocating for, and they are like, stable team. And I believe it's really very important to have this, very strong team of ambassadors. But when we talk about another point which we had in Ukraine, we really have a very good entry point, because we choose National Anti-Corruption Bureau as a pilot institution. And I think now that probably it was a very good choice, because they were more prepared than others. And probably it's good for the very beginning to have, more open people, more safe environment, and so on for testing and piloting. And we were very lucky to have Gary and Darren having this training with detectives. And actually, these people from your training, Gary, they became core of national instructor team now. So they like very good this sustainability process, and we have not only training but also working with people to make them grow, yes, and to become instructors for us. As for sustainability, I believe that it's really very important to engage as many institutions as we can, because at the moment we understand that National Anti-Corruption Bureau is good, but it's not enough, because we have National Police, we have Prosecutor General Office, and so on. And now we have a cross-sector instructor team, and it's very good, because they can talk with their colleagues on very different language, argument, and absolutely proper for very different institutions. And it probably creates some shared language, not only for the very complete group of people. Another point I believe is very important in terms of sustainability is working with mid-level management. Because usually we train, detectives or prosecutors, but actually we really need to engage people who take decisions and who sometimes can set the standards or talk with, Prosecutor General or head of investigative agency, and look, guys, we need to change in this direction, and explain why. And I believe that even in war crimes cases, when we build this capacity inside the infrastructure, we involve mid-level management as a priority, because they need to understand the standard and then they can push forward. Another point, universities. I don't know, it's probably very different in different countries, but in our case, it's very important when this course is in leading universities. It's about, changing the culture from the very beginning, talking with the students, talking with academia representatives, because their voices really matter, and they can be your, let's say, ambassadors or allies in this advocating process. And I strongly believe this, the same thing which Gary already mentioned. We need to work on the legislative framework, because we really need to create some very environment which allows detective and prosecutor use investigative interviewing properly. And infrastructure, I would say in our case, is the reason as well, because when we talk about investigative interview, they really need to have appropriate infrastructure inside the institution. And now we have this shift as well, because managers are thinking how they should change, these interview rooms, how they should find the space to create this space for proper interviewing. I would say probably these are very important for sustainability.
So Gary, then, from your international experience implementing investigative interviewing frameworks, what to you makes Ukraine's progress stand out, and what could other countries that are seeking to implement investigative interviewing learn from this approach?
Okay, what a big question. So
Not an investigative interviewing question, I'm sorry.
yeah, I think I am amazed at how much has been achieved in a relatively short time. It is quite incredible, and I sort of stepping back and looking at it from the outside, I think as I've mentioned, legislation is important, but if you step behind that, the first thing is really understanding what is going on within the context of that country. And I mean in terms of what are their systems, how do they view their justice system, what do they expect it, how do they expect it to work, because it isn't the same everywhere. So you can't just do one size fits all and think you're going to go and be able to just implant your ideas wherever. So that's the first thing I think is really understanding the landscape. And then before you decide in what direction, the other thing is what's the overriding objective? Because in the UK's context, and I look at where we are now, bearing in mind, as I said, we probably started this journey in the late 70s. What was the objective? Well, the original objective was to minimize malpractice. It was an anti-corruption tool, really. It was about removing the number of miscarriages of justice and the malpractice that was going on. So it's really important right from the outset to decide what your actual objectives are, because you are going to be on a long road. And so you need to be able to know whether you're still heading towards your destination or whether you've been kind of sidetracked. As Yuriy was saying, it's any country, let alone one as big and expansive as Ukraine, regardless of what's going on there, it would still be a monumental task to be able to put across minimum standards across the entire territory. And let alone you might have so many different organizations and different areas that might have different ways of working or different approaches. So for me, objective is really important. What is it you're trying to do? Because it's good to have values and say we want to promote human rights. That's a really good goal to have, but that may not sort of resonate with other elements of the criminal justice system as much as, well, actually, I just want to deal with what's right in front of me at the moment. That's my key. If you ask, for example, I don't know, somebody who's debriefing prisoners of war, they might be looking at really kind of direct objectives. And if you can speak to that by saying, this works better than what you're doing currently, that's a good start. So that's what I mean about identifying how each person or each unit's, each organization's objectives might be slightly different, but you can still have an overarching strategy for how you're going to approach that, which is one of the things I thought was so important about how Ukraine approached it. Because one of the things I was really impressed with was on those initial courses, we had representatives from many different fields. I think there were prosecutors, there were academics, there were detectives, there might even have been a couple of judges. There were all sorts of different organisations represented there. And they were individuals who were going to be able to go back and seed change. And I think that you can't do all the change in one place and expect that it's going to spread on its own. It's not going to do that. And I think too often with something like investigative interviewing, we kind of see it as that's a police task. But ultimately, all that is creating a product for another part of the justice system. So we have to see it as part of the whole, and that's why sort of certain things I think have to be there right from the beginning. As Yuriy spoke about, recording of interviews, it's kind of a basic element there, but it is so fundamentally important, and it would be pointless training people to interview and then not having a decent way to ensure that product was usable. Not only was it usable, that it had integrity to it. These things, they're not individual, they sit together. So if there was a legislative decision that we were going to record interviews, that isn't any good if the courts aren't set up to accept that kind of evidence. So that might need legislative changes. So we need to look at the product from beginning to end, and everybody has to be involved in that. And that's why I think it's it has moved so far in a relatively short time. I mean, I look at if I talk about the UK and from the 80s, and I look at where we are now, we're still on that journey. Yes, we may have a system that, on the whole, we can say is ethical and sound and producing good results, and one that is fits with human rights legislation. Is it perfect? No, it's not. There is still a lot that can be done. So it's a constant move forward. You never get to the end point, and so to get as far as you have in the time you've done, I think is a miracle. So that's my little take on it.
No matter how much work you put into this, there will never be a perfect interview, unfortunately. That's just the reality of what we're working with. But before we move on, we have received, I see that you've been working behind the scenes here, Yuriy, already assisting me with answering the Q&A or helping out with the Q&A. But I wanted to take that question and give you a chance to elaborate a bit on it live. So Matt Williams is asking what interviewing model is being used in Ukraine now, and you might want to have a chance to answer that live as well. And that's you as well can chip in, Vasylyna, if you like.
We took the PIS model for the basis, definitely, and we just, instead of 5 elements, we put it in 6 stages, because the establishing the rapport we just built formally in 2 pieces, focusing on psychological aspects of this and some formals, because we understand that even when you notify the suspect or witness about his or her rights, it's also a part of a rapport building process from the one side. From another side, it's pretty formal and obligatory for the investigator to do it in a proper way. And that's why we decided to slightly separate these two stages. But I don't know, 99% of the models definitely this model.
So we've discussed this a bit already. So when it comes to implementing investigative interviewing, I mean, Ukraine is a huge, vast country. But where do you see the biggest, and this is a question that I guess goes out to all of you, and whoever wants to feels the call can start to answer. But where do you see the biggest opportunities to embed investigative interviewing more deeply across all of Ukraine and its institutions? I mean, where are the biggest challenges even? I mean, biggest opportunities or challenges?
I can start,
Yeah.
maybe then
Please.
Yuri and Gary, because I'm thinking very often what we can do more and what we should do in this regard. I believe that some, let's say, formal regulation or national standard should be very concrete. And I believe it's very important, not having only something like international standards, but also some very concrete national guidelines and regulations. And we are, for example, in Ukraine, we are working on this. I think we already have some general peace model regulation standards, but now, for example, we are working on together with Office of Prosecutor General on national protocol for interviewing children, for example. And there are very different opportunities for elaborating this very concrete guidelines for practitioners, because probably it's very supportive instrument after trainings and during practicing, let's say, in this way. Another thing we are thinking of that's very important to have very good integrated into the system training ecosystem. You know, not only one or the second one, but probably multi-level training system. For now, it's our dream, but we will work on that one, and it should be integrated from the very beginning till some advanced training for professionals, for example. And I really believe that it's not easy to build this training ecosystem from the very beginning, but it really gives this, sustainability and system change. Another thing I believe that we can go deeper is quality assurance. But I believe it's very hard and sensitive question here in Ukraine, because usually quality assurance is something it can be perceived like control mechanisms. But we try to introduce this as a development mechanism, and it's something which is not, for example, very popular in our professional community. And it's about shift in culture and in mindset that I can have this, some instrument of peer-to-peer review or something like this, and I can, grow in my skills, in my ability to conduct the interview properly. And it's something we want to really go deeper and introduce as an instrument and probably as a, some cultural thing for the system. Probably that, and Yuri already mentioned this, but I really believe that we need in every jurisdiction which are looking with the change, we need to have some impact assessment too. I know that we are discussing this point with colleagues from Norway and Brazil and UK, that they are working on such a tool, but I believe that it's very important sometimes to not stop just the whole country, but for example, for the team, and monitor and assess where the progress is achieved and where we need to go deeper. And there's probably another point which is very important, not to lose something very important, which can be, lost in all this complex context.
So we have a question in the chat as well that touches upon exactly what you were speaking about now, Vasylyna, and I would like to read that out loud as well if you want to add to that, Yuriy in particular. So this is from Joe Rodriguez, and he asks how you are monitoring and evaluating the quality of interviews in Ukraine to make sure that the new standards are not just on paper, but visible in real life files and outcomes. If you want to elaborate a bit on that, if there's a bit more on that.
You start with, and I would support.
Okay, we only on the very beginning in this issue, we absolutely acknowledge that it's very important, but again, we are elaborating this monitoring tool, and we have the draft already, and we have even some experience of reviewing the recorded interview by practitioners. But we really will go, I believe, through the pilot project again. We will find the department or agency who will be more ready than other to pilot this quality assurance instrument, and who will be ready to share with others. And then we will go deeper, maybe to have this instrument, elaborated in more detailed way with training of mentors or instructors who can go do this peer-to-peer. We are still considering this option.
I'm just maybe to add what Vasylyna said, we also was thinking that, but it just at the moment is an idea, which is discussing with our Norwegian colleagues. I know that in UK there are some development on that. That's the quality standards for the profession. That's, it's a separate issue because, for example, we all know ISO, when you talk about any technicians, technical quality, there are several standards when you can measure whether you fit or not. But in law enforcement at the moment, there is no such a criteria. And for us, they should be definitely for professional, for detective, and for the agency. And which is important when you could measure the agency, whether they fit the standards, whether they have interviewing rooms or they don't, whether they have, whether they plan investigations or not, which instrument they're using, whether they analyze evidences or not, which instrument they're using. And they would definitely should be standards for that. And we are thinking that definitely we should move there because it could, provoke in a good meaning of this word, some again competition between institutions. But even within the institutions, you could compare several detective units, for example, and to find that this detective unit is better because they fit the standards, other guys don't fit. And it's, we are thinking that such kind of instruments and standards could also potentially promote these standards. When investigative interview is like obliged standards. If you don't conduct it, so you can't work in this agency, or you can't work in this institute, or in this department, sorry. That's potentially these ideas we're also thinking about.
And Gary, perhaps you can share a little bit about how that is being monitored in the UK, or if there's any interesting research that we might be inspired by from your side.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting and almost, I wouldn't say separate issue. I think clearly it's very important to the main task. But I think part of the difficulty in the past is that we have kind of taken the interview. Where does it fit into the investigation? What have we achieved from it? What's come out of that interview? And it's as if that's the beginning and end of it. So it was either productive, and we've got good information from it, or it wasn't so productive. And there wasn't really a particularly developed sense of evaluation, because even if there was an evaluation, it was mainly an evidential evaluation rather than a view on how the interview was conducted. So, because even if it was, who's doing the evaluation? What are they doing it on? Is it the basic that they comply with legal requirements? It was very unlikely that it would be a sophisticated evaluation, because you're relying on the person evaluating having at least as much, if not more, interviewing expertise and knowledge than the people doing the interviewing, and then you've got to rely on the time. And so if it was just the fact that you've got that role because you're supervising the team, it's highly unlikely that you're going to be spending a great deal of time supervising the product, because you're going to be looking at the investigations overall. And one of the things that I found problematic, certainly as an interview advisor, where I did used to do quite a bit of assessment, is that it can become quite difficult or lengthy before you appreciate that there is a problem, because quite often cases will work their way through to court, and cases fail for many reasons, and it would only be occasionally that an interview might come to the fore as a direct reason for an investigation or prosecution failing. And that is not a good place to start if you're trying to uncover the quality of your interviewers. And I think the difficulty we have, and which is why I think it's so important, as Vasylyna pointed out, that you need to get middle tier management involved, is that they have to appreciate the importance of that task. Because of course it sits within a wider investigation, and there are other issues that are also tasks within the investigation that are important. But often it is interviews that will hold everything together and will ultimately pull that together to the point where you might have a prosecution. And it's very rare for you to be able to put a case together without a number of well conducted interviews. So I think the difficulty is often we have to ensure that those middle management appreciate the central importance of good interviewing practice, and that's harder than you might think. And it's certainly something that I saw as a blind spot throughout my career, really. And I think being able to identify, because the other thing is, if you've got people working in the department and they've got a variety of skills, shall we say, what are you going to do with them? If you've got people that are not, they're not developed enough, or they need further training, you may not have the ability to chop and change your personnel at will if they're doing other things well. So these are kind of a microcosm of problems when you're looking at the grand scale of things. But it goes back to that: what is your objective? You don't want to make perfect the enemy of good. You've got to decide what your baseline is and focus in on the things that really, really matter. And I do think evaluation is really important, because we know the degradation in skill that comes post training. If there is no other focus on it, within a short space of time, people can end up, back where they started. So there needs to be some ongoing, at least focus on what people are doing within the interview room. And I think evaluation clearly is something that can do that. So it's how you put that structure in place can be quite difficult.
I think once you have that structure, please share it with us, because I think everybody's interested in learning how we can do that in a more efficient and systematic manner. Because I know that evaluation and monitoring, it's typically something that suffers in when there's high stakes and time pressure, of course, on individual investigators as well.
Well, I think in one sense, one thing is probably going to be coming down the pipe has got to be an automated process of at least basic evaluation.
Yeah.
That seems to me possibly the only way that will be in a position where you can keep monitoring at least a reasonable level of the output.
So we need to start rounding up at some point, but we got a very interesting question, I think, from Georgina. If I can relocate that one, I wanted to have give you a chance to answer that one, because she asks, does current training in investigative interviewing in Ukraine include personal trauma-focused self-management skills, given the difficult circumstances of the Russian invasion? This is from Australia, and I think maybe Vasylyna, if you wanted to elaborate a bit on that. I know you've been working on the topic, so.
Yeah. First of all, usually our project leaders and investigators, especially those who are working with war crime, they have not many, but they have training on self-management, and given this circumstances they are working in. It is not a part of basic investigative interviewing training, but it's a part of training on vulnerability. It's like next level, and there is a part that we talk about self-management and trauma-focused communication. But I must say that we have really a lot of this type of trainings now for Ukrainian criminal justice practitioners, and not only connected with interview, but also just as people, just human beings, because for sure they are people just, and they are working in very hard conditions, and they need support. And even our organization is doing training with the partners on resilience of prosecutors who are investigating war crimes. And I believe that we need to put efforts into capacity of these people, not through them at some moment.
Thank you for that. And I believe we need to start rounding off. But I wanted to give you each of you a chance to say something about the next, what you see as the next big priority for advancing investigative interviewing in Ukraine. If you have any reflections on that, maybe starting with you, Yuriy.
What we also discovered during, when working on investigative interviewing, that it's pretty difficult to change reality in a small piece of investigator's life, and not to change the rest. And that's important, because if we talk to investigators that he or she has to, effectively prepare to the interview focus, but he or she do not prepare to the investigation, that's the issue, because investigative interview is just a small part of the investigation, and interviews is just a small part of the investigation. That's why, and thanks again to our Norwegian colleagues, when we started to work on investigative management. And from my perspective, they're totally dependent on each other, and investigative management is what should go in line with investigative interview. Because investigators should understand where he or she are going to, and where investigative interviewing could be a part, how this instrument could help to the overall investigation. And that's extremely important, because following our activities, we came to the need to have a good planning instrument. And some people just don't plan. They just think that there is no need to plan, because come on, that's life, how you could plan it. But we came to very practical instruments, how to introduce planning, which has been based on vision where you're going to, not a list of actions you have to do, but okay, for which element of crime you want to prove, which evidence. And for me, maybe as a manager now more, but anyway, and in my role before, that was the biggest issue. Sure, investigative interview definitely should proceed. We need to cover all investigators. We'll go deeper in specialization already, because we have a good developments in child interviews in Ukraine, and in juvenile criminal justice system as well developed, and definitely should go there. But fully, maybe particularly the issue of Georgina. So the specificity of the context in Ukraine, that both sides are vulnerable, and that's an issue, because the typical interview process, which could go pretty well, could come to explosion from any side at any time, at any minute, just because of this overall stressful context. How to provide it, how to minimize this risk, how to work not just with the difficult, let's say, opponent, but in normal stressful condition, how to manage yourself first, ensure how to be able to calm down your partner whom you're working with. So that's, from my perception, it's maybe should be one of the significant focus. We understand how many people are in such situations, but anyway, having instruments for this situation, how to self-management, as well as the investigative interview in a difficult, stressful context, that I would maybe, from my perception, I would prioritize it. And again, an investigative management is like a brother or sister or father of investigative interview, which should go in line.
And do you want to answer this question as well, Gary? I mean, what do you foresee as the next big thing for implementing investigative interviewing in Ukraine?
I think it's a very unique position and point in time, and I guess for me, probably it feels like the most important thing, and some of that I think has been touched on, is to appreciate how much the context of what's going on at the moment is going to be very much played out within the interviewing context. It's easy to look at the bigger processes at play within the justice sector, but in the end, it all comes down to individuals and the way that they go about their work. And I think that given where things are, and it was touched on about things like the impact of trauma. The fact is population is traumatized. The fact is it's not going to just come to a close and everybody moves on. This is probably a generational thing, and as such, it will impact and influence how life moves on. And the fact that there has been an unwillingness to move away from human rights principles and to try and keep the direction moving towards a fair justice system, what we do know is that when those things are done right, when those principles are in place, that they do have the capacity to heal. Therapeutic jurisprudence is a concept for a reason. If the justice system is unfair and seen to be unfair, and it doesn't treat those that are subjected to it on whatever role fairly, then it's society that suffers. And so I think what happens in the years ahead is going to be so important, and this is definitely the right direction, because to maintain those human rights despite everything, and to be able to try and move towards a fair process within the overall system on an individual level is critical. So I think it's just being aware of all of those things, that the fact is it's about what's going on for individuals as we move through that, and objectives just have to be realistic within that process. It's not going to be perfect, but it's the overall direction of travel that matters.
Thank you so much, Gary. And finally, Vasylyna, do you foresee any what will be the next big priority for Ukraine now?
I think our biggest achievement for this past 5 years was that 5 years ago, we had discussion here in Kyiv, what is the standard about, and should we consider here this as an option for Ukrainian criminal justice system? Now we do not have this discussion, should we do that or not? We have just discussion how we can do that, what lessons we already have, and what we can do more. And I believe it's a big shift inside criminal justice system and in policy and on policy level as well. But what are probably next big priority, I think we need to find this right way moving from this momentum to institutional stability. And here is an issue in legislation for sure, and this training system as well. The second one I would add, and I really believe that it matters, it invest in these people who are or can be these national instructors, because actually it's very important who are teaching other people, who are talking about this change. And I believe that these people, the right selection of ambassador instructors, they make significant change in their environment. And it's absolutely important when we talk about this change inside the system. So we need more this, tried, dedicated practitioners who are ready not only practice standards, but also teach and talk with the colleagues as well.
Thank you so much. I think that was an excellent way of ending today's webinar on a good note. Chris, I can see you popped back in. Do you want to say something, some final words before we close?
Thank you, Susanna. But I really want to thank our guests today, Yuriy, Vasylyna, and Gary. This was an amazing conversation. Thank you especially to Yuriy and Vasylyna for joining us tonight. And we wish you good health and safety and to your loved ones. And I appreciate everybody coming today. And Suzanne, why don't you close us out?
That was just about what I was going to suggest, Chris. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And as Chris mentioned in the beginning of the conversation, please make sure that you submit your abstracts for the iIIRG conference by the deadline, which is coming up in 10 days from now. The extended deadline. Isn't that right? I hope so. So I
That's
don't
right. The 27th.
misinform anybody. And please, we would love to see you all at the iIIRG conference in Leuven, Belgium, and the masterclass taking place from 6th to 10th of July. And thank you so much again to our panelists and everybody listening in. Stay safe, and it's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you
Take
all.
care. All the best.